What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, you read the title, you know what time it is. We are going over the top 10 fantasy players for the 2021 season. With the NFL draft officially completed and in our rearview mirrors, this is the part of the year where we're going to start to ramp up our offseason content. That means more uploads for you guys, more structured content with recurring series that you can see develop, and with most of the major roster moves already being completed, a lot of the ADPs and values that we're starting to see from this point forward are going to hold true till draft day. If you don't want to miss out on any of that, just make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It's completely free, and about 40% of you out there that watch these videos regularly are not subscribed to the channel. If you happen to be one of the people who haven't yet hit that subscribe button, consider doing that today. Every like, every sub, it really helps us out greatly, and we'll be here pushing out content for you throughout this entire off season. With that being said, before we jump into the video, let's hop over to the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which running back with at least 10 targets had the highest percent of their team's air yards last season. The correct answer was actually Lynn Bowden. Congratulations to the always sharp John Jacobs, who was the first to get this right on YouTube. And as for Twitter, we have a fresh name at The Bold Takes. Once again, congrats to both of you. But as for today's stat of the day, which wide receiver that was able to eclipse at least 1,000 receiving yards in the 2020 season accomplished that feat with the least amount of receptions? Once again, that's which wide receiver to eclipse 1,000 receiving yards did it with the least amount of receptions. Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Without further ado though, let's hop right into the video, and we are going to be using the ADP of Fantasy Pros when it comes to establishing which players are going to be in the top 10. It's not going to be our top 10 rankings. It's going to be the ADP in Fantasy Pros that we're using to determine the top 10 players. But I did go ahead and let you know if we have a running back or wide receiver that we have ranked higher or lower. I've also included our current ranking for them, both overall and positionally. It should come as a surprise to nobody though that the first player coming off the board based on current ADP is none other than Christian McCaffrey of the Carolina Panthers. McCaffrey himself is now over a year removed from that epic 2019 season in which he had 287 touches on the ground for nearly 1,400 rushing yards. But even more impressive was his astounding work in the receiving game, a season in which 2019 he saw 142 targets, 116 receptions to eclipse 1,000 receiving yards at the running back position. Clearly, he was getting it done on the ground, through the air, and he was scoring too. While in his first two seasons being unable to eclipse 7 touchdowns on the ground, he really ramped it up, over doubling that to 15 in 2019. Anybody in that season who was able to draft McCaffrey or trade for McCaffrey had a significant advantage, and most of them made it to the playoffs and beyond. For those reasons, it's no wonder why the following season he was a lock to be drafted first overall in fantasy drafts. Unfortunately for him though, fast forward now to the 2021 offseason, we know that this season really didn't go as planned for the Carolina Panthers, and more specifically Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey did only appear in 3 games throughout the entire season. Respect to him, being able to put up over 90 fantasy points in a mere 3 starts. But regardless, he was somebody that you had to roster for the entire season. A lot of people either traded for him or were fielding a lot of trade requests on him. He was looked at as the type of player to potentially return healthy by the end of the season, to be that type of player to take you to the next level when fantasy playoffs came around. His final healthy appearance though was in week 9 against Kansas City. Ultimately, anybody that drafted him or traded for them ended up being disappointed. For that reason, while he still is a player that many people are drafting first overall, I also see the burn factor affecting some people who may have an early draft spot and opt not to take the same player that plagued them the season before. It's the classic fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me scenario. But me speaking personally, as somebody who had drafted Christian McCaffrey and was one of the people who did get burnt, I'm not going to be sitting in that camp. If I do have the number 1 overall pick, I'm going Christian McCaffrey 10 out of 10 times. Some roster moves that are going to be very important on the potential value of Christian McCaffrey for 2021 comes down to some offensive pieces that have left. The biggest impact, of course, being at the quarterback position, moving on from Teddy Bridgewater, who had a pretty successful first season in Carolina. He's now been shipped to Denver, and in turn, the Carolina Panthers have signed former first-round pick Sam Darnold. One for one, I can't say that Sam Darnold's going to be an upgrade in any way, shape, or form based on what we've seen through him throughout his career, but the fact of the matter is, we really don't know what the true potential yet is for Darnold. While the most likely outcome is to be labeled a bust, there is always a chance that he could come out and surprise us just due to the ineffectiveness of the previous coaching staff he had. I'm not going to be quick to give him many excuses because we did see just a season ago Teddy Bridgewater come in from a new offense, pick it up pretty fast, and put up a lot of productive numbers. If Sam Darnold struggles out of the gate or is not quick to make those same type of adjustments that Teddy Bridgewater did, Sam Darnold may be out of a job, and if the replacement isn't much better, this could have an impact on Christian McCaffrey. Now, from a volume perspective, he's as safe as they come. You know, any lack of success from the quarterback position is overall going to lead to more volume. So even though there will be additional red flags in the draft selection of Christian McCaffrey first overall, I really don't think there's a better option out there. Moving into the next player, currently ranked second in ADP, is another running back. It's Dalvin Cook of the Minnesota Vikings. Dalvin Cook finished the 2020 season as the second best fantasy running back, seeing the most volume that he's ever seen throughout his 4-year career, while also compiling career highs in both touchdowns and rushing yards. Just to put it into perspective, Dalvin Cook was a player averaging over 24 fantasy points per game and posted 0 games under double-digit fantasy points. I will say, though, that the work in the receiving game did take a bit of a small dip, but that's to be expected because they did add in more weapons in the passing game that they had to get integrated. Think Irv Smith, obviously Justin Jefferson. So with more options is going to alleviate the necessity of targeting Dalvin Cook at a high rate. But for a player like Cook, who has dealt with many injuries, being conscious of his overall workload is going to be the key to keeping him on the field. While, of course, opportunity always leads to fantasy points, and we want our running backs getting as many targets and receptions and touches as possible, when it comes to a player specifically like Dalvin Cook, who has dealt with many injuries throughout his career, both college and professional, being mindful of his workload and conscious of the amount of touches he's getting is ultimately going to lead to him being on the field and available more. His 2 healthiest seasons have now come in back-to-back years, both 2019 and 2020, and when we're looking at the Minnesota Vikings offense as a whole, there's really a lot to love and a case to be made for them to take even yet another step forward for 2021. Since Kirk Cousins has been the quarterback for Minnesota, they have had a target funnel going specifically through both Stephon Diggs and Adam Thielen, but we saw them with the recent integrations of Irv Smith Jr. in this offense, and Justin Jefferson proving in just his rookie season to be one of the more talented and dynamic receivers in the league. This offense has a great opportunity to mix things up, get a little bit creative, and lead themselves into scoring opportunities more frequently. When this team does get near the red zone, though, you better believe Dalvin Cook is the running back on the field. So naturally, any boost to this offense is directly going to benefit the upside of Dalvin Cook. Dalvin Cook has already proven to be one of the most consistent players in all aspects of his game. So if somebody wanted to make a case for drafting him first overall, I really couldn't fault you. Moving into the third player we have off the board, none other than King Henry. That's right, Derrick Henry of the Tennessee Titans. Now, right off the bat, I will say that throughout Derrick Henry's career, I haven't quite been the highest on him. I've completely flipped that in the past few seasons, though, because it's undeniable what he brings to the table and how this team intends on using him. One of the greatest values we have heading into fantasy drafts is knowing exactly how our players are going to be used. And when it comes to Derrick Henry, there's no question about it. And with the Tennessee Titans actually losing weapons when compared to the 2020 season and 2019 seasons, Derrick Henry, who's already a key cog and integral player in this offense, may even have to be relied on further. Anytime this team does rely on him, though, there's nothing short of success. The rushing leader for the 2020 season, while also finishing first in standard scoring leagues and third in PPR leagues. A player like Derrick Henry, who's not going to get the same amount of receiving floor as some other running backs being drafted earlier, it does turn some people off to the idea of taking him. But regardless, if you're in half PPR or even full PPR, Derrick Henry is still going to be a stud. The only real major impacts are going to come on those days where the offense really isn't getting it going. Obviously, the floor for running backs who aren't going to just instantly get 3-4 receptions per game is inherently lower. And unlike Dalvin Cook, who we had mentioned in 2020 to not have a game under double-digit fantasy points, Derrick Henry, while still having massive upside, did have 4 games in 2020 in which he was unable to eclipse double-digit fantasy points. Now, 4 games is a ratio of 25% of the total games played. And while hearing that number may sound a bit scary, you also have to come to the understanding that usually in 3 of the other 4 games, Derrick Henry's completely popping off. Just as many games as he had under double-digit fantasy points, he equally had with 35 plus fantasy points, and anytime you're getting 35 points from any player, regardless of position, that is a massive advantage in your weekly matchup. Derrick Henry is also notorious for having some of his best performances in December when we have the fantasy playoffs, and when we're looking to target players, we always want those players trending upward, and the history we have on Derrick Henry does prove that. My only concerns with this Tennessee Titans offense would just be the lack of depth that they have. While Derrick Henry himself has proven to be durable throughout his career, if the team has to rely on him more, give him even more volume than he's already receiving, which is kind of hard to believe in itself, but if that happens, or a receiver like AJ Brown does go down, I could really see that taking a major toll on Derrick Henry's production. But each of the first 3 players we've already gone over, I have said do have some red flags themselves, so Derrick Henry's not a player I'm avoiding by any means, and in fact makes a great target in the early first round. The next player we have, yet again another running back, Saquon Barkley of the New York Giants. When it comes to a player like Barkley, you have to understand that a lot of people will be higher on him and then many people will be lower on him. So you're going to see a bit of variation from where he's going to be ranked in the ADP depending on platform. While I personally am in the camp that's high on Saquon Barkley, it's difficult to defend him because he is a player who's technically been trending down since his rookie season. In his rookie season, he finished as the #1 overall fantasy running back, averaging over 5 rushing yards per attempt, eclipsing over 1,300 rushing yards, and even on a New York Giants offense, which wasn't incredible, he still was able to score the ball 15 separate times. This is also a player with one of the best and brightest receiving backgrounds in the entire league. That historic rookie season, once again, 121 targets, 91 receptions for over 700 yards. We did see a lot of those numbers go down the following season. His sophomore season, one could consider it a sophomore slump, but yet again, he was banged up a bit, and this was really when we started to see the struggles for the New York Giants offense make their way. All of that did lead to the 2020 season, this past season where he only appeared in 2 games. The New York Giants offense just looked completely dysfunctional, despite having a plethora of talented wide receivers on the field. Daniel Jones just continued to look inconsistent. No receiver truly stepped up with consistent volume and consistent production, and Saquon Barkley himself, we're of course going to give him a pass just due to having an injury, but even in his healthy game, the first game of the season, he did receive 15 touches on the ground, but unfortunately was only able to come up with a mere 6 yards. Now he did make up for that as he usually does with his work in the receiving game, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 60 yards. That's a floor right there of 12 fantasy points before even getting a touch on the ground, which is exactly why I tend to lean in the camp that regardless of what you think of Saquon Barkley regressing or this offense not being great, the floor is going to be there. Barkley's still a dynamic playmaker with big playability, so the upside will make its way in as well. I also really love that this team did go out and try to solve the issues at the wide receiver position by targeting the top wide receiver on free agency, Kenny Golladay, who fits in quite well to exactly what this team needs. This team already has a lot of slot speedsters, but are lacking that big physical presence. Kenny Golladay being one of the bigger bodied wide receivers in the league, somebody with a track record and history of success in the red zone, is exactly what the New York Giants could use, which ultimately will have a trickle-down effect to Saquon Barkley. Moving over to the next player, we have yet another running back. That's Alvin Kamara coming off the board, 5th overall for 2021. Kamara is coming off of a season where he finished as the #1 overall running back in fantasy and PPR leagues, 2nd in standard, and we really have to give him some credit for doing that. This was on an offense that was missing pieces throughout many parts of the season. Drew Brees not available the entire year. They're playing with Taysom Hill as the starter at points, Michael Thomas in and out of the lineup consistently, and Alvin Kamara, typically a player who plays better when all of his pieces around him are healthy, so he can rely on his big playability, his efficiency, in trying to get open in space, with defenses not trying to sell out in order to stop him when he's easily looked at as the best player on the field by opposing defenses. I think that's a major reason why a lot of people are losing some of the trust for an early draft pick into Alvin Kamara. This is, of course, a player who had never eclipsed 1,000 rushing yards on the ground, never receiving 200 totes on the ground in any season either. And even looking at his receptions, while consistently between the range of 81 to 83 throughout his 4-year career, while that is on the high side compared to other running backs in the NFL, it's not as if he has a stranglehold on volume when compared to all other receiving running backs. No, it's a foregone conclusion that Alvin Kamara, if he is going to finish in the top 3, top 2, top 1, he is going to do that with much less volume than the other running backs that are competing for that same goal. And historically, it hasn't been an issue. We've had a healthy Drew Brees that didn't look as bad as he did last season. Michael Thomas looking to be one of the best, if not the best receivers at what he does. So there were a lot of things that could be relied upon to not put all of the pressure on Alvin Kamara to do too much. Heading into 2021, the Drew Breesless Saints are going to move forward with a combination of Jameis Winston and Taysom Hill, two quarterbacks that inherently by style are going to have an adverse effect on a player like Alvin Kamara. So for anybody out there who's truly worried about drafting Alvin Kamara in the early first round, I can understand why you feel that way. Me personally though, I have no fear in drafting him yet again. The way I see it, the New Orleans Saints can't be more clear in what their intentions are for this offense moving forward. They want to slow the game down. They want to limit mistakes, which ultimately leads me to believe that we are going to see much more Taysom Hill than that of Jameis Winston. Even though I can see a scenario where Jameis Winston as a full-time starter would lead the New Orleans Saints to being a top 3 scoring offense, I do believe that the carelessness of Winston would put them in situations where the game may get out of control. Both times that this team lost in the playoffs, they lost by 1 score and vowed to not put themselves in that type of position moving forward, which is when they started to make the changes to this offense to be much more secure and safe, focusing more on defense and ball control. With the increased amount of rushing plays that they will be able to have with the combination of Kamara and Hill, with Latavius Murray sprinkled in, against most teams, the New Orleans Saints offense should have a lot of control of the clock, ultimately leading to a lot of third and fourth quarter leads. In those leads are where you're going to see a lot of the production for Alvin Kamara, so I wouldn't be surprised to see him match or compete to exceed the volume he's been receiving over the past couple seasons. So even though the amount of plays per game may decrease when compared to previous seasons, and the offense as a whole may not be putting up the same numbers that they did with prime Drew Brees, it's still easy to see how Alvin Kamara is going to be a key role in what they're trying to do moving forward. And to put it frankly, the New Orleans Saints offense does nothing but put up top 10 running backs each and every year. For that, Alvin Kamara, barring injury, is undoubtedly in the same tier as all the other running backs we brought up this far. Alright guys, we're moving into the next player, yet another running back. We have Jonathan Taylor coming off the board 6th overall, and yet his rookie season, he finished as the 6th overall running back in PPR scoring, 4th in standard with 232 rush attempts on the ground, 1,169 rushing yards to go along with 11 rushing touchdowns, 1 receiving touchdown, and even notching in 36 receptions for 299 yards. Those numbers were extremely respectable, especially considering the slow start that he got to the season. Jonathan Taylor, only from the halfway point and beyond, was really given a lion's share workload in this offense. Only 1 game in the first 4 was he actually able to even eclipse a 50% snap share. Fast forward to his final 6 games where he accomplished that feat in 5 of those final 6. So Taylor himself is now established as a workhorse running back that's going to be receiving volume in the passing game as well on an offense that's presumably trending up with a strong defense and smart coaching staff. That type of combination can be extremely fruitful for running backs. We're talking many leads in the 4th quarter, and with a big-bodied rusher like Jonathan Taylor, 5'11", 221 pounds, relying on size in the later part of the game is something that can really break these defenses. I will also say that the wide receiver core in this offense is young and likely ascending as well. T.Y. Hilton, not quite yet over the hill, and we have Michael Pittman, who we're obviously very high on. Mo Alley Cox showed flashes. While they did lose Trey Burton, they did make a replacement 4th round pick into a tight end. And while many of their draft did focus on defensive players, it just goes to show you that they are mindful of any offensive pieces they're missing. The major part that's going to impact the overall upside for these players will come down to how well Carson Wentz plays. If he looks anything like he did last season, then the hopes of them improving from what they had from Phillip Rivers a season ago, it's not going to be very likely. But let's be frank, the bar that Phillip Rivers set was not all that high. With a player like Carson Wentz, who has in the past 4 years played at an MVP caliber level on separate occasions, I'm not going to completely count him out because the Philadelphia Eagles offense was very dysfunctional for 2020. Regardless though, Carson Wentz isn't going to necessarily need to do so much. Like I had mentioned, this is a team heavily focused on their defense. Establishing the run game is going to be very valuable for them, which ultimately means Jonathan Taylor is going to be arguably one of the most important pieces featured in this offense. If he's able to remain healthy all season, a top 5 finish should surprise nobody, and if Carson Wentz is able to return to anything like his MVP caliber level, or even 80% of that, Jonathan Taylor has top 3 upside. Alright guys, I may sound like a broken record, but we have yet another running back. The 7th player off the board based on current ADP is Nick Chubb. Now Nick Chubb is a very unique player to actually break into the first round. This is one of the few players that doesn't get hardly any work in the receiving game. There's also a very competent running back that is splitting touches with him in a 1A, 1B type scenario, which ultimately means the overall volume that we can expect for Nick Chubb is unlikely to be as high as some of the other players being drafted in this range. In addition to that, he's not going to get as much work in the receiving game because they do have Kareem Hunt, who they do prefer to use on passing downs. So as long as Kareem Hunt is on the roster, we can't expect him to take a massive step forward in the volume area of the receiving game. With that being said, it's easy to see how some people could get scared away in the risk of drafting Nick Chubb, but there's just something different about Nick Chubb. He has the juice, he's special, he's one of the few running backs that just gets it done anytime he touches the ball. Despite Nick Chubb being viewed as a more one-dimensional running back, which inherently is a tell to opposing defenses, allowing them to sell out a bit more in order to stop him, you would think that that would be detrimental to his efficiency, but even a quote-unquote one-dimensional Nick Chubb is still one of the most efficient running backs in the entire league. In his 3 professional seasons so far he's played in, not one season has he dipped below an average of 5 yards per carry, and despite being on what's looked at as a more subpar offense, still trending up albeit, Nick Chubb in just 12 games in 2020 was able to score 12 separate times. So while many people are looking at Nick Chubb as a player who's not going to receive as much volume, he's a bit more one-dimensional, he's coming off of an injury season where he missed 4 games, on an offense of the Browns that already has its own stigma, there's a lot of things that are going against Nick Chubb, and if that results in him dropping in ADP and becoming a better value, you should definitely pounce on that. The Cleveland Browns, they're not the Cleveland Browns of old. They've been consistently trending upward in a slow and steady pace. This wasn't done overnight. They've competed against some of the better teams and in some cases looked very impressive in doing so. I would not be surprised one bit to see offense improvement from the Cleveland Browns from 2020 to 2021. And with Nick Chubb finishing the 2020 season with over 200 fantasy points in a mere 12 games, finishing inside the top 12 in PPR and inside the top 10 in standard, doing that while only appearing in just 12 games and being banged up in other ones. I think the sky's the limit for Nick Chubb, and if anything were to happen to Kareem Hunt, this is a player that could easily have that top 5 upside, and if this offense for the Cleveland Browns is to improve as I would expect and a lot of others are expecting, then even the type of production that Nick Chubb was putting up last season should get an inherent uptick as well. Moving on to the next player, we have none other than Ezekiel Elliott of the Dallas Cowboys. Now this is going to be one player that has dropped heavily in the rankings since last season that I'm not really agreeing on, and yes, I get that from an efficiency standpoint he didn't look as good, and Tony Pollard, the other running back in this offense behind Ezekiel Elliott, did have flashes of excellence at times, which may have inherently made him look bad. A lot of people are very down on Ezekiel Elliott. Ezekiel Elliott this time last year was a player that was talked about as a top 3 draft pick option. Nobody in their right mind at this point has Ezekiel Elliott in their mouths when in the discussion of who's being drafted in the top 3, and as much as I think he's being undervalued at this point, I really don't see him rising even close to that high. The reason though I still do believe in him is because running back value and running back production is heavily tied into offensive success, and whenever an offense loses their starting quarterback, especially an MVP caliber Dak Prescott in 2020, we really shouldn't be overly critical on the lack of success of Ezekiel Elliott. The passing game, yes, it did succeed in some points. Amari Cooper, of course, was a top 20 wide receiver, but a major factor into why the Dallas Cowboys receivers were still able to put up productive fantasy seasons with quarterbacks like Andy Dalton at the helm was because they were playing from behind the entire game. It's very difficult to get a running back volume in the 3rd and the 4th quarter when you're down 2 scores, and when you're not having much success in the passing game, it's going to be a lot easier for the defenses to focus on a player like Ezekiel Elliott. If you just look at the volume he received in 2020, he had 244 touches on the ground. Compare that to his other 3 healthy seasons where he had 301, 304, and 322 touches. Imagine Ezekiel Elliott was able to receive an additional 60 touches on the ground, much more more to his actual norm, then his RB9 finish in PPR leagues would probably resemble something closer to top 5 running back numbers. Unfortunately though, he didn't get the volume. This offense, they were playing from behind a lot. They weren't in scoring opportunities as frequently as they were and will be with Dak Prescott returning. So I see a lot of the issues and concerns most people have or had for Ezekiel Elliott are issues that really aren't going to translate into 2021. Unless Dak Prescott gets injured once again and they're playing with backups, then I definitely see Ezekiel Elliott having a similar value. Right now he's being drafted as the RB9. He finished as the RB9 last season. But if a healthy Dak Prescott returns and this offense is putting up 30 plus points a game, having leads in the fourth quarter, Ezekiel Elliott is going to immediately flip back to that top 5 running back option. All right, guys, we finally made it to the first wide receiver off the board. The 9th player overall, it's Davante Adams of the Green Bay Packers. Now, there's not really much that needs to be said about Davante Adams. I think we all can agree that if every quarterback, top wide receiver 1 option remains healthy all season long, Davante Adams should have no problem repeating the type of production he brought to the table in the 2020 season. Now, his touchdowns, they were extremely high, a pretty remarkable rate. He had 18 receiving touchdowns, 4 more actual touchdowns than games he appeared in. So yes, if we're doing projections, we're not going to project him to have as much of a successful season as he had last year. But realistically speaking, if we're making bets on which player we feel most confident in, a Aaron Rodgers and Davante Adams combination is once again the one I want to put my money on. The elephant in the room, of course, comes down to whether Rodgers returns or not. It's getting really difficult to know what's real and what's not from Rodgers' disgruntledness. The coaching staff in the front office, we already know, hasn't been supplying him with the type of weapons that other offenses around the league have grown accustomed to having. And while I'm sure that's not ideal for Aaron Rodgers, we do have to agree that even without weapons in the 2020 season, Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers had an MVP caliber offensive run. So to say that it's a necessity for them to load up on high-class free agents or top draft picks at wide receiver, well, yes, many teams are supplying their studs with those types of weapons. Aaron Rodgers himself has proven it's not necessary. This season, though, they did invest a 3rd round pick into a wide receiver out of Clemson, a school historically known for being a wide receiver factory. Wide receivers like Martavis Bryant, DeAndre Hopkins, Sammy Watkins, as well as Mike Williams. Each wide receiver I just listed had their flashes of excellence throughout their career. But still, regardless of how good this 3rd round rookie ends up becoming throughout the season, it shouldn't have an impact on the depth chart or target market share of that of Davante Adams. Davante Adams is a locked and loaded wide receiver 1 as long as he can remain healthy, but really outside of that, not much more is needed to be said. Let's move over to the final player on the top 10 list though, and we are of course bouncing back to running back yet again. For the final player we have in today's video, it's Aaron Jones, another Green Bay Packer. When it comes to Aaron Jones, he's already proven to be one of those players similarly to Dalvin Cook to make a play whenever he's touching the ball. And while he was expected to leave in free agency, ultimately the team re-signed him and opted to let Jamal Williams go. My personal opinion is that the exit of Jamal Williams is actually going to have a greater impact on Aaron Jones than many people give it credit for. One thing that we do know about Aaron Jones is that he wasn't always the primary back out on passing plays. This was an area where Jamal Williams was actually making most of his production. That's why that heading into the 2021 offseason, a lot of people expected them to let Aaron Jones go, the primary rusher on the ground, and in turn keep Jamal Williams as the receiving back and start to begin to develop A.J. Dillon, a big bruiser who had already started to prove himself in the playoffs last season. A.J. Dillon was never looked at as a player to be a receiving specialist. That's what led a lot of people to believe Jamal Williams was going to be the running back to stay. But when the team did opt to let go of Jamal Williams, return Aaron Jones, it's a clear sign that Aaron Jones is likely going to see an uptick in the receiving game. With Aaron Jones already being a player we don't want to see with a massively high touch total just due to his injury history, having him being able to play on more of those passing downs, those downs that are more fruitful for fantasy because they come with a 1-point floor when it comes to the points you gain for the reception. On average, the yards you gain on a reception is somewhere in the 7-yard range compared to a rush where you're looking at more for 4 yards. So the value tit for tat comparing a rush to a reception, it's night and day different. So if you're giving Aaron Jones those touches that are less taxing on his body while still trusting him in the important situations like those those red zone touches and close games, while also not taking him off the field on third down, Aaron Jones does have the ability to even improve on his previous numbers the past 2 seasons. The fact of the matter is, though, we don't need him to improve. He was a top 5 running back last year, a top 2 running back the year before, but I think with Jamal Williams now out of town, his week-to-week consistency, the safety in his floor, and the possibility for upside all have much more potential this season. But guys, that's going to do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching.